A beautiful weekend to you all. Let's take a look at the top stories dominating today's newspaper headlines. Firstly, we'll start from the Matrix newspaper. On the Matrix newspaper, which is boldly written, 400 million corruption scandal, sack Gbajabiamila now. NDC tells Tinubu that they should sack Gbajabiamila now. And 68 Nigerians repatriated. This is still on xenophobia, as 268 Nigerians are being sent back to their country. At the bottom of the newspaper, federal government clears over 39 billion pension arrears for NITEL, PHCN, others retires. On sports newspaper, World Cup Egypt qualifies as Ghana, Cape Verde crash out. At the bottom of the newspaper on entertainment, add good wife, children to your birthday wishes. Burna Boy's mom tells singer that she should add good wife, children to his birthday wishes. Away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune. On the Nigerian Tribune newspaper on page 2, which is boldly written, ADC, NDC, Atiku demand independent proof of PFIPC scandal. At the top of the newspaper on page 5 of the paper, hunger in northern Nigeria reaches worst level in nearly a decade. This is coming from the UN. Hunger in northern Nigeria reaches worst level in nearly a decade. Still in the same newspaper, appeal court overturns judgment allowing hijab at International School Ibadan. Together, people, you go to page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune. Appeal court overturns judgment allowing hijab at International School Ibadan. Together, full story, you go to page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune paper. Away from that newspaper to the Vanguard. On the Vanguard, which is boldly written on page 15, why Nigeria may miss next World Cup. Why Nigeria may miss next World Cup. To read more on that story, go to page 15 of the Vanguard paper. Federal government has questions to answer. This is coming from the PFICP scandal, saying that federal government has questions to answer. To read more and to know more about the questions that the federal government have to answer, you go to page 10 of the Vanguard newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, who really owns NDC? Who really owns NDC? This is coming from Osas Ighodaro, a celebrity and a Nigerian actress. To read more on that story, you go to page 11 of the Vanguard newspaper. Kwara Court fixes July 22nd to begin defamation case against Saraki. Kwara Court fixes July 22nd to begin defamation case against Saraki. To read more on that story, go to page 5 of the Vanguard newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Guardian newspaper. On the Guardian newspaper, which is boldly written on page 4 and 5. 3 years after subsidy removal, painful effects linger. 3 years after subsidy removal, painful effects linger. At the top of the newspaper, how political horse trading violence may shape Osun governor pool. How political horse trading violence may shape Osun governor pool. To read more on that story, go to page 8 of the Guardian newspaper. Helping individuals confront life challenges, rediscover inner strength is my passion. This is coming from a spotlight. To read more on that story, you go to page 27 of the Guardian newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Africa needs adaptive security architecture to respond to threats. Africa needs adaptive security architecture to respond to threat. This is coming from the CDS. To read more on that story, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, this is coming from State Police. Time to rebuild national consensus. Time to rebuild national consensus, coming from the State Police. Away from that newspaper to the Independent newspaper. On the Independent newspaper on page 8, multiple bank charges squeeze Nigerians. Multiple bank charges squeeze Nigerians. To read more on that story, go to page 8 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, Appeal Court overturns Oyo High Court judgment, reinstate hijab ban at IC Ibadan. To read more on that story, go to page 7 of the newspaper. Still at the top of the newspaper, Aunty Remy, why now? How one comments about Akara grants dignity of labor sets social media ablaze. Aunty Remy, why now? How one comments about Akara grants dignity of labor sets social media ablaze. To read more on that story, go to page 21 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 30, 50 days in captivity, Oyo's adopted pupils, teachers still missing, questions mount. Today made it 50 days that they adopted the Oyo school children and teachers, and up to now they have not been released. To read more on that story, you go to page 30 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph on page 2, on APC primaries, aggrieved senators rail against candidate list. Aggrieved senators rail against candidate list. At the top of the newspaper, 2027 election jitters, Dangote IPO expectations wiped 17.89 trillion naira off stock market in 7 weeks. In 7 weeks, Dangote IPO expectation wiped 17.89 trillion naira off stock market. To read more on that story, go to page 3 of the New Telegraph paper. Obeys demands Buhari Mustafa's trials in alleged $6.2 million CBN loot. Obeys demands Buhari Mustafa's trial in alleged $6.2 million CBN loot. To read more on that story, go to page 7 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, heartbreaking tales of South African returnees. This is still on xenophobia. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. On the Daily Monitor on page 2, demand for Gbajabiamila's sack heightens. To read more on that story, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. Why I can't date Nigerian celebrities. This is coming from Tense. A Nigerian musician says why she can't date a Nigerian celebrities. To read more on that story, go to page 16 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, stakeholders lured federal government 62 billion naira intervention in fight against TB. Stakeholders lured federal government 62 billion intervention in fight against tuberculosis. To read more on that story, go to page 2 of the Daily Monitor paper. Still in the same newspaper, 46 failed MFBS. 46 failed MFBS. Customers tax NDIC on prompt liquidation process. To read more on that story, go to page 5 of the Daily Monitor newspaper. Oriri adoption. Oyo government denies payment of ransom to kidnappers. The Oriri adoption is the one that they kidnap the school children and teachers. So Oyo government denies payment of ransoms to kidnappers. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the Daily Monitor newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun paper. On the Daily Sun paper, which is written on page 10 and 11, flood fear triggers panic in states. At the top of the newspaper, Supreme Court orders release of FPSO Tamara Tokoni to GHL. To read more on that story, go to page 29 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, all you need to know about proposed NYSC reforms. If you want to know more about the proposed NYSC reform, you go to page 18 and 19 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper, on the Saturday Punch, which is boldly written, how SGF requested office space for fake agency. How SGF requested office space for fake agency. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the newspaper. Families lament government silence as hundreds remain in terrorist captivities. To read more on that story, go to page 8 of the Punch newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Lagos residents count losses after flooding nightmare. This is a sad one, as Lagos residents count losses after flooding nightmare. To read more on that story, go to page 22 and 23 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Supreme Court voids First Bank seizure of GHL oil vessel. Supreme Court voids First Bank seizure of GHL oil vessel. To read more on that story, go to page 13 of the newspaper. Lastly, at the bottom of the newspaper, Emefiele, Buhari should have faced trial over $6.2 million fraud. Coming from an investigator saying that Buhari should have faced trial for over $6.2 million fraud. To read more on that story, go to page 10 of the Punch newspaper. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Eso. Do have a beautiful weekend.